What happens when Hollywood's most environmentally conscious star meets television's most beloved daytime host in what was supposed to be a routine morning show interview? The answer is television gold that nobody saw coming, and the moment that ended Ellen's career. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really caused Leonardo DiCaprio to completely lose it on live television. Trust me, this story has twists you won't see coming, including the shocking revelation that came out 3 days later. The Ellen DeGeneres show studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as producers scrambled to finalize last-minute details. But something was different today. 3 producers had already quit that morning, and rumors were swirling about Ellen's recent behind-the-scenes behavior. Leonardo DiCaprio sat in the guest chair, adjusting his microphone with the practiced ease of someone who had done hundreds of interviews. What he didn't know was that Ellen had spent the previous night researching every tabloid story about his lifestyle, preparing what her team privately called the takedown. Across from him, Ellen DeGeneres shuffled through her notes that were supposed to be about his environmental documentary, but were now filled with pointed questions about private jets and yacht parties. Her producers had convinced her that controversy was the only way to save her sinking ratings. The cameras rolled, and Ellen opened with her trademark warm smile. But viewers at home would later notice it never reached her eyes. "Good afternoon, Leo. Thanks for joining us today." "Good to be here, Ellen," DiCaprio replied, settling back in his chair with that characteristic measured confidence. He had no idea what was about to hit him. "So, let's talk about your new documentary, another climate change film where you play the concerned activist. Some critics are saying you're beating the same drum over and over. How do you respond to that?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the warm-up question they expected. DiCaprio's expression shifted slightly, the easy smile tightening around the edges. "Well, Ellen, I think those critics might want to actually look at the science before they dismiss the urgency of this crisis. Each project I work on brings new information and perspectives to the table." Ellen leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "But isn't there a pattern here? The wealthy Hollywood actor who lectures everyone about their carbon footprint while flying private jets around the world. Some might say there's a contradiction there." A gasp rippled through the studio audience. This was not the Ellen they knew. The studio audience remained silent, but backstage, producers began to take notice. This wasn't the light promotional banter they had planned. This was an ambush. "You know what, Ellen?" DiCaprio's voice carried a new edge that made everyone in the studio lean forward. "Maybe the problem isn't that I'm passionate about saving our planet. Maybe the problem is that people would rather focus on perceived hypocrisy than acknowledge that we're facing an existential crisis. When you've spent decades studying climate science, when you've seen firsthand what's happening to our ecosystems, authenticity means doing everything you can to sound the alarm." Ellen's eyes lit up. She knew she had him rattled. "Speaking of authenticity, let's talk about your lifestyle. You've been very vocal about climate change, but you own multiple homes, you travel extensively, you party on yachts. Do you ever worry that your personal choices undermine your environmental message?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. DiCaprio's jaw tightened visibly, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the quiet hum of the cameras and someone in the audience whispering, "Oh my God." "That's an interesting way to put it, Ellen," DiCaprio said, his voice deceptively calm but with steel underneath. "Undermine. Let me ask you something. Have you ever dedicated your entire career to fighting for something bigger than yourself? Have you ever used every platform available to you to try to save the future for the next generation?" Ellen maintained her composure, but observant viewers could see her hands trembling slightly. "Leo, I'm not questioning your passion. I'm asking about the responsibility that comes with being a role model." "Role model?" DiCaprio laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the sound of a man who'd been pushed too far. "Ellen, I never asked to be anybody's role model. What I did ask for was a chance to use my platform to highlight the most important issue of our time. But people like you want to reduce everything to some gotcha moment about personal behavior." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I don't think asking about personal accountability is reducing anything to gotcha journalism," Ellen countered, her voice gaining intensity, and viewers could hear the desperation creeping in. "You have millions of fans, many of them young people. Don't you think you owe them consistency between your message and your actions?" DiCaprio leaned forward in his chair, closing the distance between them like a predator sensing weakness. What I owe them is honesty about the scale of this crisis. What I owe them is using every resource at my disposal to fight for their future. What I don't owe them is living like a monk to satisfy people who've never dedicated their lives to a cause bigger than entertainment. The studio had gone completely quiet, so quiet you could hear the air conditioning and the nervous breathing of the crew. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. Ellen pressed on, her daytime TV training overriding any concern about the growing tension. But her voice cracked slightly as she said, "But Leo, don't you see the contradiction? You ask people to make sacrifices while you live a lifestyle that most people could never afford." That was the breaking point. DiCaprio stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with a screech that made everyone jump. Sacrifices? You want to talk about sacrifices, Ellen? Let's talk about how media personalities profit from creating false equivalencies. Let's talk about how daytime TV profits from keeping people distracted from real issues while the planet burns. At least when I make a documentary, people learn something that might save their children's future. A woman in the audience audibly gasped. 3 people started recording on their phones. Ellen remained seated, but her voice rose to match DiCaprio's intensity. And for the first time, viewers heard the real Ellen, not the TV persona. That's not the same thing, and you know it. We're talking about your responsibility as a public figure. No, Ellen, we're talking about your need to create controversy where none exists. DiCaprio shot back, his refined demeanor completely gone now. This was supposed to be about my documentary, but you've turned it into some kind of personal attack on my character because your ratings are in the toilet. The audience collectively inhaled. He'd said what everyone was thinking. The host's professional demeanor didn't just crack, it shattered completely. Nobody's conducting a personal attack. These are legitimate questions that any responsible interviewer would ask. Responsible interviewer? DiCaprio's voice carried a dangerous edge that made security guards shift nervously. Is that what you call yourself? Because from where I'm standing, you look like another TV host trying to score points by tearing down someone who actually fights for something meaningful while you dance with celebrities and pretend everything's fine. Ellen stood up now, too, the pretense of a friendly interview completely abandoned. Her face was flushed, her hands shaking. I've been doing television since before you were making blockbuster movies, Leo. I don't need lectures on responsibility from someone whose idea of environmentalism is making documentaries while living like a billionaire playboy. The insult landed like a physical blow. DiCaprio's face flushed red, and for a moment, everyone in the studio could see exactly why he'd never married. The passionate activist was visible beneath all that Hollywood polish. Is that what you really think? DiCaprio asked, his voice dropping to a whisper so threatening that the boom operator had to adjust his equipment. That I'm just some hypocritical celebrity who got lucky? Ellen straightened her blazer with hands that were now visibly shaking, a nervous gesture that would become a meme within hours. Leo, I never said you were hypocritical, but you can't deny that your lifestyle raises questions about your commitment. You're right, Ellen, DiCaprio said, taking a step closer to the desk that separated them. The camera angle made him look like a giant looming over her. My lifestyle does raise questions. Questions like, why am I one of the few people in Hollywood willing to risk my reputation to talk about uncomfortable truths? Questions like, why do I spend millions of my own money funding climate research while other celebrities stay safely silent? What questions does your career raise, Ellen? The studio crew exchanged nervous glances. In the control room, the director was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling for what was clearly going to be television history. My career is built on bringing joy and positivity to people's lives, Ellen replied, but her voice sounded hollow, desperate. Her knuckles were white as she gripped her index cards like a lifeline. When someone has the platform you have, they should expect scrutiny about how they use it. Scrutiny for what exactly? DiCaprio's refined accent was becoming more pronounced with each word, making him sound like an angry professor. For caring about the planet? For using my success to amplify scientific voices? Or are you trying to scrutinize me for having the audacity to demand action on climate change despite not being perfect myself? Ellen felt the interview slipping away from her like sand through her fingers. Her competitive instincts kicked in, but desperation made her sloppy. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about whether your message is undermined by your personal choices, especially when you're asking regular people to change their lives. Personal choices? DiCaprio laughed bitterly, a sound that would haunt Ellen's dreams. Ellen, have you actually researched any of the environmental work I do? Or did you just read the tabloid headlines your research team handed you? Because if you had done your homework, you'd know that I've donated over $100 million to environmental causes and have spent decades funding conservation efforts around the world. But it's still hypocritical, isn't it? Ellen pressed, not realizing she was digging her own grave. The private jets, the yachts, the multiple mansions. What kind of message does that send? DiCaprio shook his head in frustration, but there was something else in his eyes now, pity. The message it sends is that this crisis is so urgent that even imperfect messengers need to speak up. That sometimes when governments fail, when corporations fail, individuals have to step up and do whatever they can. But you wouldn't understand that, would you, Ellen? Because you've spent your whole career safely in the entertainment bubble, making people laugh while the world burns around you. The personal attack hit its mark. Ellen's professional composure didn't just crack, it imploded. That's completely unfair, and you know it. Entertainment is about bringing happiness to people, not about living every cause personally. Is it though? DiCaprio challenged, moving even closer. Because it seems to me like entertainment has become about creating false controversies that distract from real issues. You came into this interview with a narrative already written in your head, didn't you? Your ratings are tanking, your reputation is in ruins, and you thought attacking me would save your career. The studio fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. Ellen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I came into this interview prepared to ask legitimate questions about the disconnect between your message and your lifestyle. Ellen shot back, but her voice cracked on the word legitimate. If you can't handle that level of accountability, maybe you shouldn't be doing advocacy work. The suggestion that he couldn't handle pressure was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. DiCaprio's eyes flashed with genuine anger, the kind of fury that could move mountains or end careers. Handle accountability, Ellen? I've been accountable my entire career to scientists, to environmentalists, to future generations who will inherit the planet we leave behind. The difference between me and you is that when people question me, I don't hide behind some entertainment persona. I back up my words with action and billions of dollars. And what about the action of walking away from this interview? Ellen asked, her voice carrying a challenge that would cost her everything. Because that's what you're doing right now, isn't it? Running away when the questions get too uncomfortable. The accusation stopped DiCaprio cold. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, processing the implication that he was a coward. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet it was barely picked up by the microphones, but every word cut like a blade. You think I'm running away? Ellen sensed she had regained some control and made the mistake of pressing her advantage. I think you're used to interviews where people praise your environmental work without asking tough questions. I think when someone challenges you to examine your own contradictions, you get defensive. Defensive? DiCaprio repeated the word like he was tasting poison. Ellen, you want to see defensive? Defensive is what you're doing right now. Hiding behind your daytime TV credentials to avoid admitting that you walked into this interview looking for a viral moment to save your dying show. I'm doing my job, Ellen insisted, but even she could hear how weak it sounded. Your job? DiCaprio's voice rose again, and several audience members actually flinched. Your job is supposed to be entertaining people, not creating drama for ratings. But that's what this is really about, isn't it? You need something controversial to happen because daytime TV is dying and you're desperate to stay relevant in a world where people can get their content from anywhere. The accusation struck so close to home that Ellen's professional mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated completely. That's ridiculous. The Ellen DeGeneres show has been successful for nearly 2 decades. Has it though? DiCaprio pressed his advantage like a master chess player moving in for checkmate. Because from what I hear, you're hemorrhaging viewers, your staff is fleeing, and there are rumors about who you really are behind that fake smile. So you invite me on hoping I'll give you a viral moment to distract from your own scandals. Nobody wanted you to say anything controversial, Leo. We wanted you to have an honest conversation about your environmental advocacy, Ellen said, but her voice was shaking now. Honest conversation? DiCaprio scoffed, and the sound echoed through the studio like a death knell. This isn't honest, Ellen. This is you trying to manufacture controversy because you think destroying me will somehow save your career. Well, congratulations. You're about to get your wish, but not in the way you expected. Ellen realized the interview had completely derailed, but her pride, and perhaps her desperation, wouldn't let her back down. If this is what passes for discourse from Hollywood's leading environmentalists, then maybe the critics have a point about celebrity activism. The condescending tone was the final straw. DiCaprio's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and everyone in the studio could see him fighting the impulse to do something that would end both their careers. You know what, Ellen? You're right about one thing. This conversation is over. DiCaprio began to unhook his microphone, but Ellen made the biggest mistake of her career. So that's it. When the conversation gets challenging, Leonardo DiCaprio just walks away. I guess that's the kind of leadership your environmental movement really represents. Someone who quits when things get difficult. The words stopped DiCaprio dead in his tracks. His hand froze on the microphone clip and slowly, deliberately, he turned back to face the host. The look in his eyes made several crew members take an unconscious step backward, and one camera operator would later say it was like watching a lion decide whether to pounce. What did you just say? DiCaprio's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the silent studio like a threat of violence. Ellen knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but her television ego wouldn't let her retreat. I said, maybe this is who you really are. Someone who talks about saving the world, but runs when faced with real scrutiny. Real scrutiny. DiCaprio moved back toward the interview area, but this time he didn't sit down. He stood directly in front of Ellen's desk, towering over the seated host like an avenging angel. You want real scrutiny, Ellen? Let's talk about real scrutiny. Let's talk about spending 3 decades watching our planet burn while politicians ignore the science. Let's talk about dedicating your life to fighting a crisis that most people would rather pretend doesn't exist. Let's talk about being attacked constantly for caring too much about humanity's future. Leo, please sit down, Ellen said, but her voice had no authority left. She sounded like a child begging for mercy. No, I don't think I will, DiCaprio replied, and his voice carried the weight of every environmental disaster he'd witnessed. See, you call me a quitter, Ellen, and that's something I can't let slide. Because if there's one thing I've never been in my entire career, it's a quitter. The passion in his voice was magnetic. Even Ellen's hostile studio audience found themselves leaning forward, caught up in his words despite the uncomfortable tension. When I started making environmental documentaries and everyone said it would hurt my box office appeal, I didn't quit. When I was trying to get climate change taken seriously and critics said I was just a pretty face, I didn't quit. When I've been called a hypocrite 1,000 times for daring to care about the planet while being successful, I didn't quit. And I'm sure as hell not going to quit because some washed-up talk show host thinks she can tear me down to save her sinking career. But here's what really gets me. DiCaprio continued, his voice gaining momentum like a tsunami. You sit behind that desk in your comfortable studio with your dying show, and you judge me for the choices I've made. You question whether I'm authentic, whether my work has value, whether I deserve to speak on environmental issues. But what have you built, Ellen? What have you contributed to solving the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced? What have you done besides smile and dance while the world burns? Ellen tried to interrupt, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Leo, I think you're misunderstanding. No, I understand perfectly. DiCaprio cut her off with the precision of a surgeon. I understand that you're a failed comedian who lucked into a talk show and spent 20 years pretending to care about people while treating your staff like garbage. I understand that your ratings are tanking, your reputation is destroyed, and you thought ambushing me would somehow save your pathetic career. The studio had gone so quiet that the only sound was Ellen's labored breathing and somewhere in the distance, a phone buzzing with what would soon be thousands of notifications. DiCaprio looked directly into the main camera, and millions of viewers would later say they felt like he was speaking directly to them. You know what? I think people are smart enough to understand that fighting climate change is more important than whether the messenger is perfect. I think they're smart enough to appreciate when someone uses their platform to highlight the greatest crisis of our time instead of wasting it on celebrity gossip and fake sincerity. He turned back to Ellen, who looked smaller somehow, not just diminished by the confrontation, but actually physically shrinking in her chair. "So here's what's going to happen, Ellen. I'm going to walk out of here, and you're going to have your viral moment. But it won't be the kind you wanted. People are going to watch this clip and see exactly who you really are, a desperate, fading star who thought she could tear down someone who actually matters." DiCaprio reached for his microphone one final time. "One more thing," he said as he unclipped the device. "Next time you want to have an honest conversation about environmental work, try actually researching what advocates are doing instead of preparing an ambush based on tabloid gossip. You might learn the difference between real leadership and whatever this pathetic performance was supposed to be." With that, he dropped the microphone on Ellen's desk, the sound echoing through the studio like a judge's gavel, and walked toward the exit. The cameras followed him until he disappeared through the door, leaving behind a stunned host, a shell-shocked audience, and a studio full of people who knew they had just witnessed the end of Ellen DeGeneres' career. Ellen sat alone at her desk for several long seconds, staring at the microphone like it was a smoking gun. When she finally looked into the camera, her voice was barely audible. We'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same. Within hours, #EllenExposed was trending worldwide. Within days, 3 major sponsors pulled their advertising. Within a week, the show was canceled. And it all started with one question about private jets. What did you think of that explosive confrontation? Did Leonardo DiCaprio go too far, or did Ellen deserve everything she got? The internet certainly had opinions. Drop yours in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories of the moments that changed television forever.